mentioned several times that Terraform keeps track of the current state and reads the desired state from the configuration file, right? So every time we do Terraform apply, or we have done Terraform apply or destroy, in the outputs we'll have the refreshing state messages, right? So for the resources that are available in the configuration file, or we have defined here, Terraform refreshes the state and then it calculates in the background whether anything needs to be done in order to get from the current state to the desired state. Now, how does Terraform know what the current state of the resources defined here is? Now, if you look in that Terraform folder that we have our main.tf file in, 2 additional files have been generated by Terraform, and these are called terraform.tfstate and tfstate.backup. So this is a JSON file basically that gives us a list of resources and their current state. And Terraform generates these files on the first apply, right? The first time we execute Terraform apply command, Terraform actually goes to AWS because that's our provider. It connects to our AWS account. It executes whatever we define in the configuration state, and then it stores the current state in this Terraform state file. And whenever we make changes and reapply these changes, this Terraform file gets updated. So basically, this is like a state store for Terraform to get that up-to-date information. And this refreshing output that you see here, what this basically does is refreshing this file and setting new information here. Because we have destroyed all our resources, right now the resources is an empty array. So current state basically is we have none of the resources that are defined here in the AWS account. And the backup file is actually the previous state for the resources. So before we deleted all our resources, this was a state, the previous state with all the information here. And it is saved as a backup to have a previous state as well. So now let's go back to our TF state, which shows that the resources is empty. And let's now actually reapply this whole configuration. So let's do Terraform apply. Let's actually do auto approve so that we don't have to confirm it. So Terraform sees that the current state is basically empty resources. So it compares it to the desired state and it creates all the resources that we have defined, right? And these are basically the names of the resources with resource type and resource name that we gave it. And now if we go back to our Terraform state file, you see the empty array of resources has been filled in with new information. And each element inside this resources array is basically one configuration resource component we have defined here. So first we have data, this whole thing here that stores the information that we get as a result of querying this existing VPC. So we have the default VPC information here in data, AWS VPC, existing VPC object. And since this is a default VPC, we have attributes associated to that VPC, right? We have the ARN, we have the CIDR block of the default VPC, and so on. As the next object, we have the AWS subnet, dev subnet 1, again with all the attributes of that subnet that were all fetched from AWS and stored in here. And we have another subnet and the VPC that we created. So all our 4 components, right? All these 4 are stored in the state. And in the backup, we have again the previous state, which was empty resources before we reapplied our configuration. And as I said, Terraform uses these files here to manage the state and update the current state in order to know what changes need to be done to take us from the current state to desired state. And obviously looking into this Terraform state, especially if we have hundreds of resources created in our account, is going to be pretty difficult, especially if we're just interested in some of the attributes and we don't want to see the whole object with all the attributes. Terraform actually has commands so that we can access the information inside the state. So let's go back to the command line. And if I do Terraform State and just return, here you see all the subcommands of Terraform State we have available. So we can list all the resources that are in the state. So we have, again, 4 resources. We have the resource type and resource name, as well as whether it's coming from a data. We can also show a specific resource, for example, this one right here, and all this configuration to that specific resource in the output. And this can be actually a very useful command because in the configuration file itself, we're just defining a handful of attributes. The rest of them get generated by AWS, right? So if you want to know the attribute values for the other attributes that AWS sets, instead of going to the management console and finding that specific resource and then checking its attributes, we can just print it out here. So for example, if we want the ARN of the resource or the ID, which gets generated by AWS, we don't set this, we can easily look it up in here. Another use case could be if we're creating an EC2 instance that gets a public IP address assigned to it automatically by AWS. We want to get that IP address and we can actually check it using Terraform State show command for our AWS EC2 resource. So there are multiple use cases where we would need to check some information about a resource we just created. And we have a bunch of other commands like pulling the current state from AWS, as well as making changes in the state, which most of the time we shouldn't directly interact and update the state or update this file ourselves manually. It should be done by Terraform itself as a result of applying our configuration. And if I remove this resource, let's say using Terraform destroy command or by just removing it from here and apply, let's remove this one as well. And let's do Terraform apply with auto approve. You see that state got up to date and 2 components got deleted. And in the state file, we now have just 2 components, as well as if I do Terraform state list, these are the 2 components left in our state.